Hi everyone, it's Leela from Miss Kiss Creations. Welcome back to my channel. Today's video is going to be this beautiful glittered peekaboo hydro dip tumbler. All of my materials will be posted in my description below like always. As for the glitter and the Marabu Easy Marble paints, I did purchase from glitterheartcompany.com. I will be posting a coupon code in my description below. It is a one-time use. It is 15% off your first order off of anything on their website. And I'll also be adding links to any other materials I use, like my tumblers and my epoxy. And if you do end up liking this video, please give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more tumbler and craft videos. And with all that being said, let's go ahead and get started on this tumbler. And before I start on the tutorial for the tumbler, I just wanted to show you a close-up on how the glitter sparkles through the epoxy and how you can see the hydro dip over the glitter. So I don't think the other angle really showed, so that's why I just wanted to show you all a close-up. For my first step, I took my 25-ounce barrel tumbler and I went ahead and I sanded it with a 180 grit sanding block. I then sprayed it and wiped it down with 91% alcohol. And then I went ahead and I spray painted it with a flat or matte white spray paint. I just use white. I use Rust-Oleum or Krylon, whichever brand you have on hand. Then I waited about 25 to 30 minutes for the spray paint to be completely dried. So I'm gonna add my glitter first to this tumbler. The way that I add my glitter to my tumbler is the epoxy method. So I mix a very little amount of epoxy and I add it to my tumbler. So I went ahead and I mixed my epoxy off camera. And what I recommend for this, since you are going to be mixing a very little amount of epoxy, is if you have some leftover epoxy from another tumbler, go ahead and make a batch of epoxy, do your other tumbler, and then you should have a little bit left over. And that's what I use for this tumbler. And usually I have more left over than what I use. So the amount of epoxy that I typically use to apply my glitter is about 5 milliliters of epoxy. So that's 2.5 milliliters of part A and about 2.5 milliliters of part B, totaling 5 milliliters of epoxy. You want a very little amount of epoxy applied to your tumbler because you want your epoxy to act as an adhesive. If you add too much epoxy to your tumbler, then your epoxy is going to absorb the glitter and it's not going to shine. You're going to see it kind of just look funny. I don't know if you've ever done it on accident before. I know I have. It's not going to have a very even look and it's not going to glow or sparkle as much as epoxy does. So how I make sure to put a very little amount is I just dip my finger into my epoxy cup and then I spread on the tumbler. I know a lot of people, they drizzle the epoxy on and they wipe it off. If that's what works for you, then that's what works for you. Go ahead and do that. But the way that I like to do it is I just take my time with this and I just dip my finger in my epoxy and then I just apply it to the tumbler like so, and then I spread out around the tumbler. And I want to make sure I'm getting every part of the tumbler. I want to make sure every single part is coated because obviously if there's no sticky part on the tumbler or no epoxy, then the glitter will not stick to just the tumbler. So again, this epoxy is just an adhesive. You don't want it very thick. So the way I like to think about this is if you've ever sprayed adhesive to your tumbler and then added glitter, if you notice the spray is so thin you can hardly see the spray. That's how thin you want your epoxy. So that little amount of spray is enough to have your glitter stick. Just imagine how little of epoxy you need to have your glitter stick to the epoxy. So I'm going to finish this up and I'm not going to neglect the bottom. So make sure you're doing the bottom and then I'll return. Now that I have my epoxy on my tumbler, I'm going to take my heat gun and I'm going to just apply a little bit of heat to my tumbler with my heat gun. The reason why I do this is because I'm adding such a little amount of epoxy that sometimes I add streaks or lines to the tumbler, and those streaks or lines will really poke out whenever I apply my glitter. So I want to make sure my epoxy is as smooth and as evened as possible. So by making sure that, I go ahead and I use my Wagner heat gun and I just apply a couple coats of the heat on the tumbler. I'm now going to glitter my tumbler, and I have my catch paper down. And this is just to catch the glitter whenever I add the glitter, so I can glitter, have it fall, and then put it right back into its container. And since I'm doing one color, I just need one color or one catch paper for my tumbler. And I can just apply the glitter whichever way I like. So you could start from the top, you could start from the bottom, whichever way is easier for you. I'm just gonna start from the bottom and then work my way to the top. So now I'm going to turn off my cup turner so I can go ahead and glitter the bottom. And how I glitter the bottom is I just angle my tumbler down with the bottom up, and then I apply the glitter, still tapping it like salt, and I just focus on the edges. So I focus around the edges, and then I'm turning as I'm applying the glitter. So you see it just kind of rolls right down, and it just rolls right down to the middle. And I just make sure I have one even coat, focusing on that rim, or I should say the edge of the tumbler. And then I just pat off all the excess glitter, and then I'm going to place it back on the turner, and I'm going to turn on my cup turner. Now that I have my glitter on my tumbler and I'm happy with how much glitter I have on my tumbler, I'm now going to let my cup turner spin on the turner for about 2 to 4 hours. After about 2 to 4 hours, I'm then going to mix another batch of epoxy, and then I'm going to apply the epoxy over the tumbler. The reason why I wait only 2 to 4 hours and not 24 hours for this step is because we're adding such a little amount of epoxy to the tumbler that it only takes 2 to 4 hours for it to really dry. You don't need a lot of drying time because we're not adding a very thick amount of epoxy on the tumbler. And I always like to tell y'all a window between a certain amount of hours, because my temperature, my brand of epoxy, my airflow, everything, my humidity, everything in my room could be different than yours. So my tumbler could take 2 hours. Your tumbler may take 5 hours. So the way you check this is you just come back to your tumbler after about 3 hours and just try to touch your tumbler. And if you feel kind of stickiness on your tumbler, or if it's wet or if it's damp, then your tumbler is not dry. Wait another hour and it should be fine. So up to 5 hours, I would say your tumbler should be completely cured and you'll be ready for the next step. Now that my epoxy is dried under my glitter, the next step is to apply epoxy over the glitter. I mixed a total amount of 20 milliliters of epoxy. That's 10 milliliters of part A and 10 milliliters of part B. I then allowed my tumbler to be completely dried or cured for 24 hours. Once it has been 24 hours, I'll be back with the next step. And now my tumbler is ready to be hydro dipped. I took a grocery bag and I put it over my football. That way, whenever I dip my tumbler, the football doesn't get wet with the water. I also will be using my stir stick, and if you don't have one of these, you could just use a popsicle stick. And then I also will be using a piece of cardboard, and you'll see this is just to scrape out the excess paint whenever I'm finished. As for my water level and temperature, I have my buckets about 3/4 the way full, maybe halfway full. The way that I fill up my bucket is I use a water hose. So I don't specifically use cold or hot water. I use whatever comes out of my water hose. So I've used hot water, I've used warm water, I've used cold water. If you don't have a hose or a water spigot, you can also fill it up in your tub. Whenever I fill it up in my bathtub, I just use warm water. So I turn on the hot all the way and I turn on the cold all the way, and then I fill up my bucket. The amount of water that you need depends on your tumbler. So as long as your water level is as high or as tall as your tumbler. So what I do is I just place my tumbler on the side of my bucket and I fill it up above my tumbler, because you want your tumbler to be completely submerged in water. So if you were dipping a mug, you would need a little less water. If you were dipping maybe a 30-ounce skinny, you'll need more water. Before I open my paints, I do want to let y'all know that I do typically dip my paints outside, but for recording sake, I'm actually doing it inside so I can get the best volume so y'all can hear me. But I do have my craft window open and I have an exhaust fan, and if the fumes do get too much or the smell gets too much for you, you can also use your respirator mask. Another thing is these paints, they will get on your clothing, so wear some clothes that you don't really care about, just like as you would working with epoxy. The colors that I'll be using today will be listed in my description below. I'm using light blue, pearl white, and dark ultramarine, and I'm also using the crystal clear. This is just clear paint, and this is what's going to allow the glitter or the white tumbler peek through the paints. I now have all of my colors open, so now what I'm going to do is just add them to the water. So I'm just adding the blues first, and then I'll add the crystal clear, and then I'll add the pearl, and I'm not doing it in any specific order. I'm just adding them the way that I open them. And I always add too much than too little, because I'd rather have more on the tumbler than less. And then I go back and I just add a little bit more. And if you see that you want more light blue, then add more light blue. If you want more of the dark blue, add more of the dark blue. So that's the clear. And then now for the pearl white. And I want to add a little bit more light blue on there. I really like how the light blue looks. And then remember, everywhere that the tumbler catches that crystal clear, that's going to be peeking through. So that's clear paint. And then now you're going to take your popsicle stick or your stirring stick, and you're just going to make little swirls inside of the paint, or the inks, I should say. And you can see it just makes this nice little swirl, kind of mix those colors a little together. And then what I do is I scrape the sides, making kind of like a film. So it kind of creates like a mask. So when I dip, it's going to absorb or kind of wrap around the tumbler. So whenever I'm dipping, I'm going to dip at an angle, and then as I'm dipping, I'm always turning my tumbler. So I'm always turning to get that swirl. So you want to go ahead and take your tumbler, and you can use gloves if you like, but since we're low on gloves, I don't want to use gloves. So I'm just going to turn and dip. So I'm going inside of the thing, and I'm still dipping, and I'm still turning, and then it's going to be filled with water, and then you're going to just place your tumbler upside down, and then you're going to remove it, and you're going to see this nice swirl. And you see how the swirls really stuck to that tumbler. So the reason why I got that nice swirl effect is because I took my stir stick or my popsicle stick, and I stirred those paints together, and as I dipped, I did the spin. So if you just dip up and down, it's going to cling to your tumbler. It's going to do that, but it's not going to have that nice swirl effect. So you see everywhere where you don't see paint, it's that it's the crystal clear. And you see that the fact that I wanted to try something new and try to use that pearl white, and all it did was camouflage, which is okay. This still turned out really, really beautiful. So there's some crystal, or there's some pearl white on this as well, but you can't see it since it's with the white. I thought maybe it'd make like an off-white, but sometimes you try stuff, sometimes it doesn't work out, and that's completely fine, because I really, really like this dip. This is really, really cute. Once you're satisfied with your dip, it's going to be wet, that's fine. What I do is I just put this on my drying rack, or you could put this on your turner, turn it on, and then it's going to air dry. I know some people use hair dryers to make the drying process go by faster. You can go ahead and do that. I just let it air dry. It takes about 30 to 45 minutes max, and then we'll move on to the next step. So I'm going to allow that to dry, and then I'll show y'all how I clean up my paint. So if you want to continue to dip more tumblers in the same bucket, you can. Just make sure you clean up the excess paint that's left behind. And the way that I do that is I take a piece of cardboard, and it can be a little smaller than this if you like, and I just put it inside of the bucket, and then you could see the paint kind of cling to the cardboard the way that it clings to the tumbler, and it gets all that excess paint from that bucket. And that way what you can do is just cut off this piece right here, and then for the next tumbler, go ahead and dip it and then scrape it up with this and keep cutting it off until you don't have any more cardboard. So that's really easy. So you can reuse this water until you don't have any more tumblers to dip. So you don't have to keep dumping it out and keep adding water to it. While I let my other tumbler dry, I just wanted to show you another dip that I did earlier this morning. I meant for this to be kind of a Christmassy color, but to me it looks more of a watermelon theme, since the red actually turned out a little pink underneath or over the glitter. So I did my red, green, crystal clear, and then I added a little bit of gold in there. So this is another dip I did. I just want to show you all the variety of dips that you're able to do. Have fun with these and create your own, and really just throw some random colors in there. You'll be surprised how the dips turn out. Welcome back, y'all. I have my tumbler completely dried. As you can see, it took about 25-30 minutes. After 25-30 minutes, I took a paper towel and then I blotted the tumbler because the inks were actually completely dried. I just needed to get all the moisture and all of the water off of the tumbler. So take a paper towel and go ahead and blot it. Now that it's completely dried, before I go into epoxy in this tumbler, you need to seal this. The way that I seal the inks is with Mod Podge. So this is the Mod Podge that I use, and again, it will be posted in my description below. And you need to do 3 decent or thick layers of Mod Podge. So make sure you are very generous with the amount of Mod Podge that you're putting on. So what you do is you do 1 layer like so, and then you let it dry. You do another layer, you let that dry, and then you do 1 last layer, and then you let that dry. So it's simple as that. So you're gonna see your tumbler turn white from your Mod Podge. That's fine because this dries clear. So make sure you are using clear Mod Podge. It should say on the container of your Mod Podge. I use the one that I showed y'all, and then I also use the dishwasher safe one, which is the light blue bottle, and it does say that it does dry clear. So I have my first layer on, and then I'm gonna wait for that to dry, and then I'm gonna go into my second, then third layer. And make sure you are getting the bottom, and you cannot put too much Mod Podge on this. I'd rather you have too much than too little, because if you have too little, then your tumbler isn't going to be sealed. So your paints or your inks aren't going to be sealed. And what's going to happen is whenever you go to epoxy your tumbler, you're going to have a lot of fish eyes. So your epoxy is not going to stick smoothly on the tumbler. It's going to be uneven and kind of wonky. So you want to make sure that you're putting 3 generous coats of Mod Podge. I'm going to let this dry, and then I'll do the next 2 and I'll return. All right, y'all, I'm back with my tumbler, and I have my Mod Podge on my tumbler. Again, I applied 1 coat of Mod Podge, I let it dry, applied another coat of Mod Podge, let that coat dry, and then I applied my 3rd coat of Mod Podge, and I let that dry as well. So we have 3 coats of Mod Podge, and make sure your Mod Podge is completely dried. Make sure it's not wet anywhere on your tumbler. Uncured epoxy doesn't react to any wet surfaces or anything. So make sure it's completely dried. And now we're going to apply our epoxy. I did mix my epoxy off screen. I mixed a total of 20 milliliters of epoxy. So again, that's 10 milliliters of part A and 10 milliliters of part B, totaling 20 milliliters of epoxy. I'm going to turn on my cup turner and apply my epoxy. Now, I didn't use a lot of epoxy for this because if you were to add a decal to this after your epoxy, then you would add about 25 to 30 milliliters of epoxy after you decal. So for this process, we are going to apply the epoxy. We're then going to allow the tumbler to spin on the turner for about 6 to 8 hours. Then we're going to turn off our cup turner, and then we're going to allow the tumbler to air dry or air cure. So you're going to have a total drying or curing time of at least 24 hours before you apply a decal to your tumbler. The reason why I wait a full 24 hours is just to have that buffer time to make sure your tumbler is completely cured. If your tumbler is not completely cured, and then you add that decal, whenever you go to add that decal and transfer tape, you rip up the transfer tape and you're gonna rip up that wet or uncured epoxy, and you'll have to do a lot of sanding, or you may even ruin your tumbler. So make sure you allow this tumbler to be completely air cured, air dried for at least 24 hours before applying your decal. Once you apply your decal, it is ready to go to another coat of epoxy. So don't hold off with, there's no reason to allow your decal to sit or anything. Once it's stuck to your tumbler, you are ready to go into epoxying your tumbler. And I really like this tumbler for Christmas time. This would be really, really pretty with some like snowflake glitter or even snowflake decals. A nice silver name would look great on this, some snowmen. So this is really good for like a winter wonderland or a Christmas tumbler. So go ahead and have fun with this again and make it your own. I'm sure whatever you create will turn out so beautiful. I have my epoxy all on my tumbler, and my tumbler is now complete. If you want to know how to clean the rim, I will be posting a beginner's help video on how to clean up your tumbler rim, also how to clean inside your tumbler, and how to prep your tumbler properly.